At her office party, someone boldly asked if my wife was available. This is the story of Nathaniel Asher Voss and his wife Priya Voss. They had been married for 9 years when the careful architecture of their life together began to show its first real fractures. Not from some great catastrophe, but from the slow, patient erosion of attention. Nathaniel was a man who loved deeply in theory and distantly in practice. A structural engineer who understood load-bearing walls better than he understood the weight his silences placed on his wife. Priya had spent years being quietly extraordinary in a marriage that had settled, without either of them quite noticing, into something that required her to make herself smaller. The tension between them was not the kind that screams, it was the kind that hums, low and constant. Beneath the surface of every shared meal and every conversation that stopped just short of saying the real thing, what would unravel them was not a single act of betrayal so much as the slow accumulation of moments in which one person chose not to be seen, and the other grew tired of asking to be. The morning of Priya's company party, Nathaniel made coffee the way he always did. Precise, unhurried. 2 cups measured to the milliliter because he'd once read that consistency in small rituals was the mark of a stable mind. He set Priya's cup on the counter to the left of the sink, which was where she always picked it up, and he sat at the kitchen island with his tablet and the structural report he'd been revising since 5 a.m. She came downstairs already dressed. That was the first thing. "You're ready early," he said. "There's a pre-event meeting with the partners." She picked up her coffee without stopping. "I might not be home until late." "How late?" "I don't know, Nathaniel." "Late." He watched her move through the kitchen with the efficient grace of a woman who had long since stopped expecting anyone to notice how carefully she put herself together. The dress was emerald green and fitted, a color she rarely wore at home. Her hair was down. She looked, he thought distantly, like the version of herself that existed before he knew her. The version in the photographs from her 20s, her work trips abroad, the life she'd lived with an aloofness he sometimes forgot she'd possessed. "You look nice," he said. She paused at the door. "Thank you." "Not you think so?" Not a smile that reached her eyes, just the flat, practiced receipt of a compliment that had come 3 seconds too late. He went back to his report. The party was at a hotel downtown, the kind of corporate affair that tries very hard to feel like it isn't. Exposed brick rented for the occasion, an open bar with a craft cocktail menu, music just loud enough to force people into a physical closeness they'd never choose in daylight. Nathaniel arrived at 8, as Priya had asked him to, dressed in the blazer she'd picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, which he'd worn perhaps 3 times. He found her near the far end of the room, standing with a small cluster of colleagues near a high table scattered with glasses. She was laughing at something, genuinely laughing, head tilted back slightly, one hand touching her collarbone in that unconscious gesture she made when something caught her off guard and delighted her. He stood watching for a moment before she saw him. Her expression changed. Not badly, just, it changed. The ease of it dimmed by a single degree. "You made it," she said, and kissed his cheek. "Traffic on the bridge." He accepted a drink from a passing tray. "Sorry." She introduced him to the group, Dimple from compliance, her work friend Yusuf, a woman named Fiona whose last name Nathaniel immediately lost, and the man Priya introduced last, slightly separately, as though his name required its own breath. "And this is Callum Hart." He just moved over from the Dublin office. Callum Hart was the kind of man who occupied space with a comfortable confidence that was not quite arrogance. Late 30s, easy in his own skin, the sort of person who laughs at himself first so no one else gets to. He shook Nathaniel's hand with a firm, unhurried grip. "Priya's mentioned you," Callum said. "Good things, I hope." Callum smiled, and something in that smile was just slightly too knowing. "Mostly." Priya lapsed softly and said "don't," and touched Callum's arm just briefly, the kind of touch that exists in the social vocabulary between people who have accumulated enough ease with each other to do it without thinking. Nathaniel filed that away the way he filed most things, quietly, precisely, in a structural part of himself that did not yet know what load the information would eventually bear. The night moved forward. He circulated. He was good at parties in the way that certain introverted men learn to be. He asked questions, he listened well, he knew when to laugh. He kept half an eye on Priya without meaning to. It was nearly 10 when he drifted back toward her and heard it. A man he didn't recognize, someone from a different department, a little loose from the open bar, had planted himself beside Priya, with the particular confidence of a man who has decided the night is going well. Nathaniel was perhaps 6 feet away, reaching for a drink, when the man said something low and then, louder, addressing Callum. "Hang on, mate. Is she actually available, or are you too?" And the room didn't stop. The music didn't cut. No one else even turned. But Priya did not immediately say anything. That was what Nathaniel would remember long after everything else. Not the man's question, not Callum's response, something brief and deflecting that Nathaniel didn't fully catch. Not even the way Priya finally smiled and said, "I'm very married," with a lightness that should have settled it. What he would remember was the pause, the 2 seconds before she answered, during which her eyes moved, not to Nathaniel, who was standing close enough to hear, but to Callum, as though checking for something, as though the answer to whether she was available lived, even for just a moment, somewhere in his expression. Nathaniel set his drink down. He said nothing. He smiled when Priya caught his eye. They drove home mostly in silence, the radio filling the space between them with voices neither of them heard. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel didn't change. That was the thing he'd come to understand about himself later. He had a tendency, in moments of internal alarm, to go very still, where other men might have demanded explanations or picked a fight to relieve the pressure. Nathaniel tightened. He organized. He controlled the controllable and watched the rest the way he watched structures under stress, with clinical attention and without yet touching the load. He noticed things. Priya's phone, which had always sat face up on the kitchen counter, now lived face down. She'd started taking it into the bathroom when she showered, which she'd never done before, but he couldn't say with certainty when the habit had started. It might have been months ago. The timing of her late evenings had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to feel like a new pattern finding its shape. He told himself these were nothing. He was a man prone to overthinking, and he knew it, and he had learned that most of the structures he catastrophized about never actually failed. But he was also very, very good at reading stress fractures. One Thursday evening, he cooked dinner, pasta, nothing complicated, and Priya came home at 7 and sat at the island and poured wine and said, "This looks good," with the warmth she was capable of when the invisible wall between them happened to be thin that day. "How was work?" he asked. "Long. We've got this Dublin integration project. A lot of moving pieces." "Is Callum heading it up?" He asked it as though it were natural. And it was natural. That was what made it useful. She looked up, and the look lasted perhaps half a second longer than it needed to. "He's one of several leads, yeah." "Why?" "He mentioned it at the party. Said he'd been pulled in on something cross-departmental." "Right." She turned her wine glass slowly on the counter. "He's good at his job." He seemed confident. "He is." A pause. "Sometimes too much so, but he gets results." There it was, the slight correction, the small distancing, the way she offered the criticism almost immediately as though it would reassure him, as though she'd already imagined him needing it. He served the pasta. They talked about other things. The boiler, a weekend trip they'd been loosely planning for months and not made any actual moves toward. His mother's birthday. Later, lying in bed with the lights off, he tried to examine what he actually felt, and found the answer was complicated in a way that unsettled him. He wasn't certain he'd felt truly close to Priya in over a year. That was something he had to sit with, because if that was true and he turned it over carefully, the way you test a beam before trusting your weight to it, then his suspicion had a context that wasn't simply about her. He thought about the night of the party. About Priya laughing with her head tilted back. About how long it had been since she'd laughed like that at something he said. He fell asleep without resolving anything, which was how he fell asleep most nights. Priya, for her part, was living in the strange, suspended state of someone managing two parallel versions of herself. There was the Priya who came home and cooked or ate whatever Nathaniel cooked, who asked about his projects and genuinely listened to the answers, because she was not a woman without love for her husband. She simply had more of it left than she knew what to do with, and nowhere safe to put it. And then there was the Priya who stayed 40 minutes later at the office on Tuesdays because Callum Hart had started the habit of bringing his afternoon tea past her desk and staying to talk. And the conversation always turned into something she hadn't expected, and she always felt afterward like a window in a closed house had briefly been opened. She wasn't lying to herself entirely. She knew what it was. She'd known people who had affairs, and she had always thought, quietly and with some superiority, that she understood the structural stupidity of it. You traded something real for something borrowed, and the borrowed thing always cost more in the end. But she also knew that whatever she felt when she drove home on those Tuesday evenings was not purely guilt. There was a brightness in it, and the brightness troubled her far more than any specific action would have. It meant the need was real. It meant something in her ordinary life was casting a shade she'd stopped noticing until something gave her light to compare it to. She thought about the party, the drunk man's stupid question, the way Callum had looked briefly, involuntarily at her, before deflecting it. And she felt a small, complicated warmth that she immediately closed the lid on. Nathaniel was a good man. She needed him to know she knew that. Which was, she would later understand, entirely the wrong thing to be focused on. The realization that shifted things came not from anything Priya did, but from something she said, or started to say and then didn't. It was a Saturday, and they were sitting together, rare and unhurried, with the weekend papers spread between them. Priya said, Callum asked about and then stopped. What? Nothing. He mentioned a restaurant downtown. Never mind. Nathaniel looked at her. She was looking at the paper. Her expression was entirely neutral, which was an expression that required effort and therefore told him something. What restaurant? He asked. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to go. A small, definitive turn of the page. He let it sit. But the unfinished sentence stayed with him the rest of the day, with the particular persistence of a load-bearing element that shouldn't be bearing anything, but is. The conversation happened on a Sunday in March, on a morning that began the same as any other. Nathaniel had his coffee. Priya was reading something on her laptop at the kitchen table. Outside, the sky was the pale, washed-out gray of early spring, the kind of light that makes everything look honest and a little tired. He sat down across from her. He hadn't planned this, or maybe he had in the way the body plans things before the mind catches up. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to take it seriously. She looked up. She read his expression and closed the laptop. Is something happening with Callum? The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. Define happening, she said finally, which was, of course, the answer. Not no, not laughter, not where is this coming from, just a careful request for parameters. The kind of response that gives nothing away and takes nothing back. I mean what I said, he replied. Something emotional, something that's changed how you behave at home. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the closed laptop and then at him, and he saw something move through her face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked more like a person deciding to stop carrying something alone. Nothing physical has happened, she said. Okay. I want you to hear that as a real fact, not a consolation. I hear it, he said, but that's not entirely what I asked. She exhaled. We talk. At work. She stopped. Started again. He listens in a way that feels like attention, real attention. And I know how that sounds, but She stopped again. Her hands were flat on the table. I've been running on empty for a long time, Nathaniel, and I kept waiting for you to notice. Something in him compressed. I work. I'm here. You're present, she said carefully. That's not the same thing. He wanted to argue. He found he couldn't entirely. So instead of telling me, he said, you let someone else fill it. I didn't let him. It's not a decision I sat down and made. And yet here we are. She didn't answer. He looked at her, really looked. and saw someone who was tired and confused and not entirely the villain of the story she put him in, which made everything considerably harder. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Her voice caught. "I want us to be different. I want to go back to when." A pause. "I don't know." That was the most honest thing she'd said in months. He recognized it as such, and he sat with it, the way he sat with difficult calculations, not panicking, but not pretending the numbers added up when they didn't. "I need some time," he said. "To decide what? To think. I don't know what I want yet. I need to not pretend I do." He got up. He rinsed his cup. He left her at the table with her closed laptop and the pale spring light coming through the window, and the conversation sat behind him like something completed but not resolved, a door carefully closed rather than slammed. By August, they were living in the same house with a formality that would have looked from outside like simple quietness. Nathaniel had moved into the guest room without announcement. He'd done it gradually, the way you withdraw from cold water rather than stepping out at once, until one morning it was simply true that he slept in a different room, and they both proceeded as though this were a fact rather than a choice. He'd started seeing a therapist, not because someone had told him to, but because he'd noticed one morning that he was itemizing structural damage in the walls of his house during meetings at work, an anxiety response so literal it had made him briefly laugh at himself. The therapist, a grounded man named Dr. Osei, asked him in their third session what he was most angry about. "I don't know if I'm angry," Nathaniel said. "What are you then?" He thought for a moment. "Embarrassed. Which is worse." "Why worse?" "Because embarrassment is about me. Anger would be about her." Dr. Osei didn't respond right away, which was what Nathaniel had started to value most about the sessions. The absence of premature resolution. Priya had ended the thing with Callum, the not quite thing, the Tuesday afternoon thing, the nothing physical happened thing, with a brief, written conversation that she told herself was clean and was not. Callum had accepted it with the equanimity of a man who had suspected it was borrowed time regardless, which told her something about how he'd understood it that she hadn't entirely wanted to know. She had expected to feel lighter. She didn't. She found herself revising the story she told friends. "Nathaniel and I are going through a quiet patch." And each time she said it, she noticed herself narrowing the narrative, sandpapering the edges of her own culpability. She'd been neglected. She'd been lonely. These things were true, and she used them the way a person uses a true thing as a shield. Not falsely, but incompletely. Her friend Divya, who was forthright in the way only old friends can afford to be, said once over dinner, "You know he worshipped you." Priya set her glass down. "I know. And you let someone make you feel special in secret, because asking Nathaniel to do it felt too, what? Too vulnerable?" "Yes," Priya said very quietly. "That's exactly it." Divya nodded. "That's the terrible part, isn't it? That it wasn't even about the other person. It was about being too proud to need the person you're supposed to need." Priya didn't answer. She stared at the restaurant table and understood, with the slow, nauseating clarity of something that has been true for a long time, that the problem had never been Nathaniel's silences. The problem was that she had stopped speaking into them. She drove home that night and sat in the car in the driveway for 11 minutes because she didn't want Nathaniel to see her face and know she'd been crying. Not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she was afraid of his kindness. His particular, considered, unbearable kindness, the way he would look at her and take it seriously and not give her the anger she'd have found easier to live with. In October, Nathaniel finished a project that had consumed the last 4 months and found himself sitting in his car in the firm's parking garage at 7 in the evening, with the particular flatness that follows long effort. He called his brother Ravi, who knew roughly what had happened and had mostly listened rather than prescribed. "How's the house?" Ravi asked. "Quiet," Nathaniel said. "We're coexisting. What do you want from it, in the end?" Nathaniel looked at the concrete pillar in front of him. He'd designed parking structures before. He thought about how weight distributes when a load shifts, how the adjacent supports take on more, gradually, until either the system redistributes or something fails. I think I want to know if I still know her, he said. If she still knows me. Before I decide anything. And does she? He didn't answer right away. That's what I'm trying to figure out, he said. They met for dinner in November. Priya had suggested it, by text, with a formality that acknowledged without naming the strangeness of suggesting dinner with the man who still lived in her house. Would you want to have dinner, properly, out somewhere, and just talk? He'd said yes. The restaurant was not special. That was deliberate on both their parts, he realized. Neither of them had wanted to sentimentalize the occasion before they knew what it was. They sat across from each other and ordered and talked first about peripheral things. His project, her promotion, which had come through in September and which he'd congratulated her on via text with genuine warmth. She thanked him in person, later, standing in the kitchen doorway in a way that had felt like two people remembering how to be kind to each other, without knowing what followed kindness. Eventually the peripheral things ran out. I've been thinking about what I want to say to you, Priya began. I've rewritten it many times. You don't have to have it perfect, he said. I know, but I want to say that I understand now what I was doing, not just with Callum, before that. The way I retreated into resentment instead of asking for what I needed, the way I made your quiet into a verdict about me. She paused. I was punishing you for something I never gave you the chance to fix. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. I've been thinking too, he said, about how I can love you and also not have looked at you properly in years. How those two things were simultaneously true and I let them be. Were they? Yes, he said it plainly. I thought being present was the same as being there. I thought consistency was love. I was wrong about the difference. The food came, they ate. The silence between them was different from the silences that had accumulated over the past year. This one was not avoidant, but simply present. The way silence is between people who have said the real thing and don't need to fill what comes after. Can we fix it? Priya asked. She asked it without particular hope or desperation, with the sober curiosity of someone who genuinely doesn't know the answer. He thought about it. He took it seriously the way he always took things seriously, and she watched him do it and felt, unexpectedly, something that was neither grief nor hope, but some combination of both, held together by the fact that she still knew his face well enough to read the work happening behind it. I don't know if what we had is fixable, he said at last. I think what we had was already. It was already weight-bearing something it wasn't designed for. We'd both been patching it from the outside for a long time. And I think the question isn't whether we can fix what was there. I think the question is whether we want to build something different from the parts that are still sound. She looked at him across the small table. Do you? The answer was not immediate. It was not romantic. It arrived the way real answers do, slowly, from somewhere interior, without theater. I don't know yet, he said. I think I want to. I think that has to be worth something. She nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't seem to care about that. It is, she said. They paid the bill and walked out into the November night, the city moving around them with its usual indifferent vitality. They didn't hold hands. They walked in the same direction because they were going to the same place. The house they still shared and had still not decided what to do with. At some point, without comment, their arms came close enough that their sleeves touched, and neither of them moved away. There is no clean ending to a marriage that goes quiet rather than catastrophic. It doesn't shatter with the satisfying violence of something broken, it shifts, like soil under a foundation, slowly and without announcement, until one day you look at the structure and understand that what stands has been standing on different ground than you thought. Nathaniel and Priya Voss would spend months still deciding, still measuring the load-bearing walls of what remained between them. They would have difficult evenings and unexpected tender ones. They would not return to what they had been, because what they had been had quietly failed them both. What they might become instead, if they had the patience for it and the humility. and the willingness to stop building from pride and start building from truth was something neither of them yet had words for, only the faint, serious hope that the ground beneath them was not gone, that it was only changed.